I found out my husband had a second family on a Sunday morning, standing barefoot in my own kitchen, holding a phone that wasn't mine. A woman's voice asked me if I was on my way. A little boy in the background begged someone not to start without him. My hands went cold before my brain caught up. 27 years of marriage, and in the space of 11 seconds I became a stranger in my own life. I grabbed my keys before I even decided to. I needed to see it with my own eyes. For almost 2 years, Michael left the house every single Sunday morning. Always the same routine: up before 7, coffee standing at the counter, jacket already on. He never explained where he was going. He'd just kiss my forehead and say, "I'll be back early afternoon," like it was the most ordinary sentence in the world. And for a long time, I let it be ordinary. That's what happens when you've been with someone since you were 22. You stop asking. You trust the shape of a person more than you question the gaps in their story. We met in college, married 2 years later, raised our daughter Hannah together in the same brick house in Ohio we still live in now. Michael is a structural engineer, the kind of man who reads instruction manuals cover to cover before assembling anything, who checks the locks twice at night, who has never once in almost 3 decades given me a reason to doubt him. He isn't romantic in the traditional sense. He shows love through fixed hinges and paid-off cars, and quietly refilling my gas tank before long drives. I built my whole understanding of him on that kind of steadiness. So when the Sunday disappearances started, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hobby. Maybe something he wanted to keep just for himself, and honestly, I understood that. Marriage doesn't mean owning every hour of someone's life. That particular Sunday, I woke up groggy, the kind of tired that makes you move slower than usual. Michael was already dressed, moving quickly, patting his pockets the way he does when he's running behind schedule. He grabbed his keys off the hook, said the same line he always said, and was out the door before I'd even poured my coffee. I stood at the window and watched his truck pull out of the driveway, taillights disappearing around the corner of Maple Street. I turned back toward the kitchen island to start my morning, and that's when I saw it, his phone sitting right there on the granite screen, dark, forgotten in his rush. In all our years together, Michael has never once left that phone behind. He's not a secretive man, but he is a careful one. It goes everywhere with him, even to the mailbox. Seeing it sitting there felt strange, like finding a shoe without its pair. I almost didn't touch it. I want to be honest about that. Some small loyal part of me almost let it sit there until he came home. But then it lit up, buzzing against the counter, and before I could think twice, I answered it, assuming it might be something urgent, work maybe, or his brother. "Hey, are you on your way?" a woman's voice said, warm and familiar, like this wasn't the first time she'd made this call. "Ethan keeps asking if you're coming." I didn't say anything. My mouth simply wouldn't move. "He won't start without you," she added, and there was a smile in her voice, easy and unguarded, the voice of someone who knew exactly who she was talking to, except she clearly didn't know it was me. The line went dead before I could respond. I stood there holding Michael's phone like it might explode in my hand. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was something colder, a kind of disbelief that made the kitchen feel unfamiliar, like I was standing in someone else's house. I looked at the screen. No name attached to the missed call, just a number I didn't recognize. Below it, a single text, sent an hour earlier, an address on Willow Street, nothing else. No hearts, no "can't wait to see you." None of the things you'd expect from an affair. Just coordinates like a meeting point. That should have comforted me. It didn't. It made it worse somehow, the plainness of it, the routine of it. Like this was simply how Sundays worked now, and I was the only one who hadn't been told. I stood frozen for a long moment, staring at that address, feeling 27 years tilt sideways under my feet. Then I did something I had never done in the entire span of our marriage. I picked up my own keys, put Michael's phone in my purse so I could return it to him later without a word, and walked out to my car. I told myself I just wanted answers. I told myself I could still turn around. But my hands were already steering toward Willow Street, my heart pounding out a rhythm I didn't recognize, some instinct pulling me forward before my mind had fully caught up with what I was doing. The drive took 18 minutes. I remember every one of them: the school zone I slowed for out of habit, even though it was Sunday, the church parking lot filling up with cars, the ordinary world moving on around me while mine quietly came apart. Willow Street turned out to be a quiet block of modest homes, porches decorated with wind chimes and garden flags, the kind of street where nothing seems capable of hiding a secret. I parked 2 houses down, engine off, hands still on the wheel. Through the front window of a small blue house, I saw him. Michael in his gray Sunday sweater kneeling on the lawn beside a bicycle. And then a boy no older than 12 came running out the front door and threw both arms around my husband's neck like he'd been waiting all week for exactly this moment. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there in my car watching a stranger's child hug my husband like he belonged to him, and felt the entire architecture of my marriage go silent around me. I stayed in that car for what felt like an hour, though it was probably closer to 10 minutes. Long enough for my coffee to go cold in the cup holder. Long enough to watch the boy pull Michael by the sleeve toward the garage, both of them laughing about something I couldn't hear through the glass. I kept waiting for the scene to make sense in the way I already assumed it would, the worst way, the way every wife fears in the quiet corners of her mind. A second family, a secret son. 27 years, and somewhere along the way my husband had built another life 2 towns over and folded it neatly into his Sundays. A woman stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and I recognized the voice before I even processed her face. The same easy warmth from the phone call. She looked to be in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing the tired, capable expression of someone who had learned to run a household alone. She called out something to the boy, who shouted back that he'd be right there. And for a moment the three of them stood together in the yard like a photograph I wasn't supposed to see. I braced myself. I told my hands to stop shaking. I told myself that whatever this was, I would face it directly the way I've faced everything else in my life, with my eyes open. But as I watched longer, something didn't fit the story I'd already written in my head. Michael didn't touch her. Not once. No hand on her back, no lingering glance, none of the small physical language that exists between people who share more than friendship. When she handed him a glass of iced tea, he took it with a simple, "Thank you," and turned right back to the boy examining the bicycle chain like it was the most important task of his week. There was no charge in the air between them, none of the electricity I would have recognized instantly even after all these years. What I saw instead looked almost domestic in a different way, practical, unhurried, familiar in a manner that had nothing to do with romance. For the next half hour I watched my husband do ordinary things. He sat at a picnic table with the boy, a worksheet of math problems spread between them, patiently walking him through long division with the same steady patience he'd once used teaching Hannah to parallel park. He tightened the chain on the bicycle and checked the brake pads. He walked to the side yard where an older man, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, despite his age, was wrestling with a push mower, and the two of them worked together to get it started, trading words I couldn't hear, but could read easily enough in their posture, comfortable, unbothered, like men who had done this many times before. Later, the woman brought out a tray of sandwiches, and the four of them sat together at the picnic table for what looked like an unremarkable Sunday lunch. Michael cut the boy's sandwich in half without being asked, the exact way I remembered him doing for Hannah when she was small. My chest tightened watching it. Not with jealousy exactly, something stranger, something closer to confusion. This didn't look like betrayal. It looked like belonging. And somehow that unsettled me even more. I drove home before Michael did, careful to stay a full block behind him at the one intersection where our routes might have crossed, my heart hammering the entire way. I slipped his phone back onto the kitchen counter exactly where he'd left it, then busied myself with laundry I didn't need to fold, my mind spinning through explanations that refused to settle into any coherent shape. When Michael walked through the door that afternoon, he looked the way he always looked after his Sunday outings, a little sunburned, faintly pleased with himself, carrying a paper bag from the hardware store. He set it on the counter and began unpacking it without ceremony. A children's book about the solar system, a small model airplane kit still in its box, a pack of colored pencils, the kind sold in bulk at the drugstore. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching him unload these things, like a man returning from an errand he'd run 100 times before. Not flowers, not jewelry, not a single item that spoke of romance or guilt or the kind of gift a man buys to soothe a conscience. Just supplies for a child who apparently needed a math tutor and someone to fix his bike chain. "Good day," I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Yeah," he said, glancing up briefly, that same unreadable calm on his face. "Good day." He didn't offer more, and I didn't push. Some instinct told me that whatever I'd witnessed on Willow Street wasn't the whole picture, that I was standing at the edge of something larger than an affair, something I didn't yet have the language to name. I thought about the boy's face when he'd run to hug Michael, the unguarded joy of it, the way he'd clung on a beat longer than a simple hello required. Children don't perform that kind of relief for strangers. They save it for the people who matter. That night, lying beside my husband in the dark, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, studying him like a puzzle instead of a familiar shape. 27 years, and I realized I had never once asked him what he did with his Sundays, because I had never needed to. Now the question sat heavy in my chest, refusing to let me sleep. I didn't say anything to him that night. I wasn't ready yet. But I already knew I would go back to Willow Street the following Sunday because whatever this was, I couldn't unsee it, and I couldn't keep pretending I hadn't looked. The week that followed felt like living two separate lives inside one house. On the surface, everything continued exactly as it always had. Michael left for work at 7, came home at 6, asked about my day, over dinner, fell asleep in front of the evening news with his reading glasses still perched on his nose. But underneath that surface, I was watching him now, really watching him in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years. I noticed things I'd overlooked before, small details that had been sitting in plain sight, disguised as nothing. A receipt in his jacket pocket from a craft store itemizing glue sticks and a poster board. A folded piece of graph paper in his truck covered in what looked like geometry homework corrections in his familiar block handwriting. A children's book about volcanoes half hidden under the passenger seat, its spine already cracked from use. None of it had registered before, because none of it had needed to. Now every object felt like a clue in a story I was only beginning to read. By midweek, our garage had acquired new inhabitants I couldn't explain to myself with any comfortable answer. A small toolbox, red-handled and clearly sized for younger hands, sat on the workbench beside Michael's. A child's bicycle helmet hung from a hook near the door, still smelling faintly of new plastic. A chess set, half-assembled, sat open on a folding table. One game paused mid-move, as if someone intended to finish it later. I stood in that garage one evening while Michael was inside, washing dishes, staring at these objects, like an archaeologist piecing together the life of someone I thought I already knew completely. When Sunday came again, I didn't tell Michael I was following him. I simply left the house 20 minutes after he did, driving the now familiar route to Willow Street, with a strange mixture of guilt and determination sitting in my chest. I parked in the same spot as before, far enough back to stay unnoticed, close enough to see everything unfold. This time, Michael and the boy, I still didn't know his name, were building something together in the driveway, a bookshelf from the look of the flat-packed cardboard leaning against the garage door. Michael held the board steady while the boy drove in the screws, his small tongue poking out in concentration the way children do when a task matters to them. The older man I'd seen the week before, the one with silver hair, stood nearby talking to a neighbor over the fence, and I caught a fragment of his sentence carried on the wind. "He's family," the man said, nodding toward Michael, his voice full of an ease that suggested this wasn't news to anyone but me. Not because he has to be, because he chose to be. Something in my chest cracked open at those words, though I couldn't yet name what feeling had caused it. I watched Michael laugh at something the boy said, a full, easy laugh I hadn't heard from him in longer than I wanted to admit. Not the polite chuckle he gave at family dinners, not the tired exhale he offered my jokes after a long day at the office. This was different, unguarded, warm, the laugh of a man who had let his walls down completely because he trusted the person standing in front of him. I sat in my car for nearly 2 hours that day, watching a version of my husband I didn't fully recognize and yet somehow felt was more honestly him than anything I'd seen in years. There was no performance in it, no obligation, just a quiet, steady devotion to a task and to a child who clearly adored him. Before I finally started my engine to leave, I heard the boy's voice carry across the yard, clear enough to reach me even from a distance. "You'll come next Sunday too, right?" he asked, and there was something fragile underneath the casualness of the question, something that sounded like a child bracing for disappointment, even while hoping against it. Michael didn't hesitate. "I wouldn't miss it," he said, simple and certain, like a promise he'd made 100 times before and intended to keep 100 more. I drove home with that sentence looping through my mind. I wouldn't miss it. Not I'll try, not we'll see. A vow spoken plainly, the same tone he used when he told me decades ago that he'd love me for the rest of his life. I realized then that whatever bound my husband to that boy on Willow Street, it wasn't casual and it wasn't new. It had the weight of years behind it, the shape of something deliberately built and carefully protected. That night, I lay awake long after Michael had fallen asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even utterly unaware of how closely I'd been watching his other life unfold. I thought about the toolbox in the garage, the geometry corrections in his handwriting, the ease in his laughter that I hadn't earned the right to witness firsthand. I thought about the old man's words drifting over the fence, not because he has to be, because he chose to be. And I understood for the first time that I wasn't looking at the wreckage of my marriage. I was looking at a mystery. And somewhere underneath my confusion, a quieter question had begun to take root, one I couldn't yet answer: what could possibly make a man keep a promise like that, faithfully every single week for years, without ever telling his own wife why? I didn't hire a private investigator. I didn't confront Michael in the heat of anger, though there were moments that week when the words sat right at the edge of my tongue, ready to spill out over dinner or in the dark quiet of our bedroom. Instead, I did what I've always done when something in my life refused to make sense. I went looking for facts. I've spent 30 years as an accountant reconciling numbers that don't add up until I find the one transaction that explains everything. I decided to treat this the same way. I started with the local newspaper archives, searching online for anything connected to the name I'd overheard the old man use for the boy Ethan, cross-referenced with our town and the surrounding county. It took less time than I expected. A headline from 3 years earlier stopped my scrolling cold: a house fire on the east side of town. A volunteer firefighter who hadn't made it out, survived by a wife and young son. The firefighter's name was Daniel Brooks. The article included a photograph, a family portrait clearly taken a year or two before the fire, showing a broad-shouldered man in uniform, standing beside a woman I now recognized instantly, her arm wrapped around a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 at the time. Olivia Brooks. Ethan Brooks. The pieces I'd been circling for 2 weeks suddenly had names attached to them, and with the names came a story I hadn't expected. I kept reading. The fire had started in a duplex 2 streets over from an elementary school, and Daniel had gone in to pull 2 children trapped on the 2nd floor. He'd gotten them out. He hadn't gotten himself out in time. The article mentioned an investigation into the fire's cause, standard procedure for any fatality, and buried in a follow-up piece from a few weeks later was a single line that made my breath catch, a quote from the fire marshal's office, thanking the structural engineer who had consulted on the investigation, ensuring the building's collapse pattern was properly understood for the final report. The engineer's name was Michael Lawson. I sat with that for a long time, staring at my laptop screen in the empty kitchen, the pieces of the last 2 years rearranging themselves into a shape I finally recognized. Michael hadn't just consulted on some abstract case file. He had walked through the wreckage of that house. He had likely met Olivia and Frank during the investigation in the rawest, most devastating weeks of their lives, when a widow and an elderly grandfather were trying to figure out how to raise a traumatized 8-year-old boy who had just watched his father die, saving him. I didn't have proof of what was said between them back then, not in any article or public record, but I understood my husband well enough after 27 years to imagine it clearly. Michael has never been a man who walks away from broken things. He's the one who stays late fixing a neighbor's fence for no payment, who spends his Saturday mornings helping Hannah's college friends move apartments, who cannot leave a problem unsolved if he believes he's capable of solving it. I could picture him standing in the ruins of that house, meeting a frightened boy who'd just lost his father, and making a decision that most people would have let slip quietly into the past. I found myself imagining the words, though I'll never know exactly what was said. Something simple, something like a young Frank asking if his grandson would be all right, or Ethan clutching a soot-stained toy and not speaking to anyone for days. And somewhere in that terrible, tender chaos, my husband saying quietly to Frank, "If Ethan ever needs me, call me." It wasn't a grand promise. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect a man to actually follow through on years later, once the investigation closed and life moved everyone back into their separate orbits. Most people say things like that in moments of grief and mean them sincerely in the moment, only for the words to dissolve once the crisis passes and ordinary life reasserts itself. But Michael isn't most people. Frank had called, and instead of letting the promise fade into something he'd once meant well, Michael had kept it quietly, faithfully for 3 years, without ever mentioning a word of it to me. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long while, feeling the shape of my anger dissolve into something far more complicated. I wasn't looking at a man who'd betrayed our marriage. I was looking at a man who had made a private vow to a grieving child, and had never once considered breaking it, even at the cost of secrecy, even at the risk of what I might think if I found out. There was something almost unbearably decent about that, and something that hurt in an entirely different way than infidelity would have, because now I understood exactly what those Sunday mornings had been for all this time. Every math lesson, every bicycle repair, every quiet afternoon spent teaching Ethan how to swing a hammer or hold a fishing rod. It wasn't a second life Michael had built apart from me. It was a boy who had lost his father and a man who had refused to let him lose anyone else one Sunday at a time for 3 unbroken years. I thought of Ethan's voice drifting across that yard, "You'll come next Sunday too, right?" And Michael's answer, steady and immediate. I wouldn't miss it. I finally understood what those words had actually meant. I waited until Sunday morning to say anything, not because I wanted to catch him off guard, but because I wanted to give him one more chance to tell me himself the way I now believed he'd always intended to eventually in his own time. He was standing at the counter, pouring his coffee, already dressed for his usual departure, when I set my laptop down on the kitchen island, open to the article about the fire. "Michael," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "I know about Willow Street." He went very still, the coffee pot hovering above his mug, and for a moment I watched something complicated move across his face. Not panic exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just realized he doesn't have to carry it alone anymore. He set the pot down carefully, like the motion itself required concentration. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. 2 weeks, I admitted. "I followed you. I heard the phone call, the woman Olivia. I saw you with Ethan. I didn't understand what I was looking at, so I did some research." He nodded slowly, pulling out a chair at the table, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades of marriage, I watched my husband struggle to find the right words. I sat down across from him and waited. I didn't ask why he hadn't told me, not yet. I asked the only question that actually mattered. "Why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands without drinking from it. "It started small," he finally said. "I met them during the investigation. Ethan wasn't speaking to anyone. Frank was doing his best, but he was 70 years old and grieving too, trying to raise a traumatized 8-year-old alone. I just started showing up, first to help with a school project, then to fix a fence. I told myself I'd step back once things stabilized, once Ethan had some kind of normal life again." "But you didn't step back," I said. "No." He looked up at me then, and there was something raw in his expression, something I rarely saw from him. Every time I thought about pulling away, I'd see him waiting for me on that porch, and I couldn't do it. He started asking every Sunday if I'd come back the next week, and I never wanted to be the person who said no to that kid, not after everything he'd already lost. I thought about the promise I'd imagined, the one I couldn't prove, but somehow knew was true. "You told Frank you'd come if Ethan ever needed you." Michael's eyes widened slightly, surprised I'd pieced that much together. "Yes," he admitted. I said it without really thinking it through. I didn't expect the call. When Frank phoned me 8 months later saying Ethan had stopped eating, stopped talking, wouldn't leave his room, I couldn't ignore it. I went that Sunday and I just kept going back. For 3 years. I said, "You kept going back every single week and you never once told me." "I know how that sounds," he said, and for the first time his composure cracked slightly, his voice thinning at the edges. "I wasn't hiding an affair, Rebecca. I was hiding a responsibility I didn't know how to explain without it sounding strange, or without you worrying I was taking on too much, or without making you feel like I'd built a whole other life without asking you first." "Which you did," I pointed out gently, though there was no real accusation in it anymore. "I know," he admitted. "At first I told myself it was temporary, so it didn't need explaining yet. Then months passed, and it felt too late to bring it up without you wondering why I'd waited so long. Every year that went by, the silence just got heavier. I wasn't protecting a secret. I think, honestly, I was protecting Ethan's world from feeling fragile. He'd already lost so much stability. I didn't want him to ever feel like I was something conditional, something that might get taken away if my own life got complicated. I sat with that for a long moment, watching my husband, a man who has never once in 27 years given me real cause to doubt his character, looking more vulnerable than I'd seen him since Hannah was born. I thought about the toolbox in the garage, the math worksheets, the laughter I'd overheard drifting across that yard so much lighter than anything I'd heard from him in years. I thought about a boy who had lost his father in a fire, asking every single Sunday if the one man who'd chosen to stay would come back again. I reached across the table and took Michael's hand, feeling the tension in it slowly begin to ease. "You should have told me," I said. "Not because you did anything wrong. Because I would have understood. Because I still love the man who makes promises like that and keeps them even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard to explain." He looked at me for a long moment, something like relief breaking gently across his features. "Take me with you next Sunday," I said. The following Sunday, I rode with Michael to Willow Street for the first time, sitting in the passenger seat of his truck, instead of trailing 2 houses back in my own car, feeling strangely nervous in a way I hadn't expected. 27 years of marriage, and I still found myself smoothing my skirt and checking my reflection in the visor mirror like I was meeting someone whose opinion mattered enormously to me. In a way, I suppose I was. Michael had called ahead that week, gently explaining to Frank and Olivia that Rebecca knew everything now, and that I wanted to come. I could only imagine what that conversation must have felt like on their end, 3 years of careful privacy suddenly opening up to include a stranger, even one who was in her own complicated way already connected to all of it. Olivia was the one who answered the door when we arrived, and I could see the wariness in her eyes immediately, the careful politeness of someone bracing for a difficult conversation. She was younger than I'd expected up close, with tired eyes that spoke of years spent holding a household together on her own strength alone. Frank stood a few steps behind her in the front hallway, his expression harder to read, arms crossed loosely over his chest, in a posture that seemed protective rather than hostile. "Rebecca," Olivia said carefully, extending a hand that trembled just slightly. "It's nice to finally meet you." "You too," I said, and I meant it, though the words felt inadequate for everything sitting unspoken between us. Ethan was the hardest to face. He stood near the staircase, half hidden behind Frank's shoulder, watching me with the particular wariness of a child who has already learned that change often means loss. I understood immediately why Michael had never wanted to disrupt this fragile world. Ethan had built his sense of safety around a very specific Sunday ritual, and here I was, an unfamiliar variable threatening to complicate the only stability he had left. I didn't try to force a conversation. Instead, I asked Olivia if I could help with anything in the kitchen and spent the first 20 minutes simply existing in the periphery of their world, letting them adjust to my presence at their own pace. Michael, for his part, moved through the house exactly as he always had, checking on a leaking faucet Frank had mentioned, pulling Ethan into the garage to look at a bicycle brake that needed adjusting. His comfort in that space, so thoroughly established after 3 years, seemed to reassure everyone else that nothing essential had actually changed. Eventually, I found myself sitting on the back porch steps beside Ethan, who had wandered outside holding a half-eaten sandwich clearly sent to keep an eye on me by some silent arrangement with the adults inside. We sat in silence for a while, the late morning sun warming the wooden steps beneath us. "I thought Michael belonged somewhere else," I finally said, keeping my voice soft, unhurried. For a while, I didn't understand any of this, but now I know he wasn't keeping a secret from me. He was just keeping a promise to you. Ethan didn't look at me right away. He picked at the crust of his sandwich, his young face working through something complicated. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly around the edges. "Every Sunday is the only day I still feel like I have a dad," he said, and then, as if the sentence had unlocked something he'd been holding in for a long time, he started to cry. Not dramatically, just quiet, steady tears that spoke of years of grief carried too privately for a boy his age. I didn't reach for him right away. I simply sat beside him, letting him have the moment, and felt my own eyes fill without quite meaning them to. I thought about Daniel Brooks, a man I'd never met who had run into a burning building and given his life so his son could keep his. I thought about Michael standing in the wreckage of that same fire, making a quiet promise to a broken family that he had never once broken. "I'm glad he kept his word," I finally said. "I'm glad you have him." Ethan wiped his face with the back of his hand, and for the first time since I'd arrived, looked directly at me. Something in his expression softened the wariness, easing into something more open, more willing. Later that afternoon, the whole group gathered in the backyard for a barbecue, Frank manning the grill with the easy authority of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. Olivia setting out paper plates and a pitcher of lemonade. Hannah, our daughter, drove over from her apartment after Michael called to invite her, curious and a little stunned by the story unfolding in front of her, but warm and easygoing as always, quickly finding her way into conversation with Ethan about some video game he loved. By the time the sun began to lower over the yard, something had shifted entirely. Nobody felt like a stranger anymore. Frank told an old story about Daniel that made Olivia laugh through unexpected tears. Michael flipped burgers, while Ethan narrated exaggerated instructions from a lawn chair, thoroughly enjoying his temporary authority. As we were getting ready to leave, Ethan ran up to me at the car, his earlier shyness entirely gone. "Will you come again next Sunday?" he asked, looking up at me with a hope so unguarded it nearly undid me. I smiled, feeling something settle warmly into place inside my chest. "Every chance I get," I told him. A year has passed since that first afternoon on Willow Street, and Sundays in our family look nothing like they used to and everything like they should have all along. They're no longer the day Michael quietly disappeared while I stayed home wondering. They're the day two families that grief and circumstance once kept separate now come together without secrecy, without hesitation, simply because we choose to. I taught Ethan how to make my grandmother's biscuits last spring, standing beside him at Olivia's kitchen counter, while he carefully measured flour with the same intense concentration he once brought to long division. He ruined the first batch entirely, laughing at his own mistake in a way that would have been unthinkable for the withdrawn, cautious boy I met a year ago. Michael and Ethan spent an entire Saturday last month rebuilding the transmission. On an old go-kart Frank had stored in his shed for years, the two of them covered in grease bickering good-naturedly over instructions neither of them fully understood. Frank has become Grandpa Frank to our whole family now, not just to Ethan. He shows up to Hannah's birthday dinners with stories about his firefighting days that keep the table laughing well past dessert. He calls Michael every other week just to talk the way old friends do. Their conversations no longer tethered to any single obligation but simply rooted in genuine affection. Olivia reopened the small bakery she'd shelved after Daniel died, and I've become one of her regular Saturday customers, sitting at her counter over coffee talking through the ordinary complications of life the way close friends do. Hannah treats Ethan like the little brother she never had, teasing him relentlessly about his taste in music, showing up unannounced to help him with school projects when she visits from Denver. Watching them together, I sometimes forget that a year ago, none of these people existed in each other's lives at all, that an entire family had quietly formed itself around a promise made in the ashes of a tragedy long before I ever knew it existed. I think often about that Sunday morning when I first answered Michael's phone, my hands cold, my mind already constructing the worst version of a story that turned out to be something else entirely. I think about how certain I was in that terrible moment that I was about to lose my husband, that 27 years of marriage was unraveling in the space of a single phone call. I couldn't have been more wrong, and I have never been more grateful to be wrong about anything in my life. What I found instead of betrayal was a version of my husband I hadn't fully seen before, even after all our years together, a man capable of a quiet, unglamorous kind of heroism, the sort that doesn't announce itself, that simply shows up week after week without needing recognition or thanks. I found a young boy who had lost everything in a fire and slowly, carefully found his way back to laughter. I found a widow rebuilding her life one Sunday at a time, and an old man who'd become a grandfather twice over to a family bound not by blood, but by choice and consistency and love that simply refused to quit. Last weekend, we all gathered again at Frank's house, the yard filled with the easy noise of people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Ethan burst out the front door the moment our car pulled into the driveway, running down the steps, with the same unguarded joy I once watched from a distance, parked 2 houses away, terrified of what it might mean. Except now that joy was for both of us. "Rebecca, Michael. Come in, breakfast is almost ready," he shouted, waving both arms like we might somehow miss him standing right there on the porch. I climbed out of the truck and walked toward that house on Willow Street, no longer a stranger peering through windows, but family walking through the front door. I thought about how close I'd come to letting fear and assumption write an entirely different ending to this story, one where I confronted Michael in anger, before ever understanding what I was truly looking at, one where I let 2 weeks of quiet surveillance harden into resentment instead of curiosity. I used to believe that whatever was hidden behind a locked door, behind unexplained absences, behind secrets, kept even from the people closest to us, had to be something painful, something meant to hurt. I've learned since then that isn't always true. Sometimes what's hidden isn't betrayal at all. Sometimes it's a promise so tender, so quietly kept, that the person carrying it doesn't know how to say it out loud without it sounding smaller than it actually is. My husband kept a vow to a grieving 8-year-old boy for 3 years, without ever asking for credit, without ever expecting me to understand, simply because he believed it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, he didn't take anything away from our marriage. He gave our family more people to love than I ever could have imagined on my own. I still think about that Sunday morning sometimes, the phone buzzing on the counter, my whole world tilting sideways in an instant. But now when I remember it, I don't feel fear anymore. I feel grateful that I followed him that day, grateful that I didn't let assumption become the whole story, grateful that on the other side of my worst fear, I found something far larger than what I thought I was losing. I want to know how far this kind of story reaches. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you every day, so make sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.